was quite distressed to see what was happening. And I'll be moderating this evening for the session, but I just wanted to mention those who actually organized the session, because I've been away the last few weeks. And mostly Canem Ozildiren, who most of you know, I guess, and have been in touch with, has put this together. Barbara Lipietz, who's a lecturer here, and another student that we have this year who's not here this evening, unfortunately, Rumeysa Bayar, who's a DPU student. So thank you very much to all our panelists this evening. We're going to have about 10 minutes each for each panelist to put forward some ideas, and then we'll have an open discussion afterwards. We have on the list actually 4 panelists. The first one is Yaşar Adanalı, and unfortunately he hasn't been able, he was supposed to join us by Skype this evening, but hasn't been able to make it. His sister has actually been detained, I think yesterday in Turkey. She's since been released, but it's been a very difficult situation for him. But I've been working with Yaşar for a number of years actually. He's a PhD candidate at Stuttgart University, and was going to talk about the context on social movements in Istanbul particularly. Unfortunately, we won't have him this evening. And we'll start with Tunc Aybak, who is Director of International Politics Program at the School of Law at Middlesex University. His main research interests and field of work include Turkish and Russian foreign policy, citizenship and identity issues in Europe, the enlargement of the EU, energy geopolitics, and pipelines with particular reference to human security issues in the Black Sea and the Middle East area. So Tunc will open, and second we'll have Karabekir, Akkoyunlu. Okay, sorry, your name is Akkoyunlu. He's a PhD candidate at the LSE, London School of Economics, where he researches political change in Turkey and Iran. He teaches classics on democratization and Middle East politics. His latest co-authored work is The Western Condition, Turkey and the US in the EU and the New Middle East, a detailed analysis of the last decade of Turkish foreign policy and its immediate prospects. So he's going to talk about to give some context on Turkey and also a little bit more general in the Middle East. And thirdly, we'll have my colleague, who's Alex Frediani. He's a lecturer here at DPU and in community-led development in the Global South and co-director of the master's program in social development practice. And Alex is from Brazil, and he's worked on issues pertaining to the right to the city in Brazil, and recently has revised the UN Habitat report on the Brazilian National Housing Program, Minha Casa Minha Vida. And so the idea for Alex is he's going to talk about what's happened recently in Brazil and to give a context between trying to draw some parallels between what has recently happened in Turkey and what is happening in Brazil. So that's quite a challenging idea, but we'll try to bring that together. So I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Cass. It's great to be here. Thank you very much. And you said you often go to Turkey. I'm from Turkey, but I haven't been really feeling at home until very recently. I think I feel more at home at the moment because of what's happening, because as they say, the past is another country. Thanks for the invitation. I haven't prepared an academic paper here. I mean, I like this. This is a debate. So I would like to set the scene for the debate. So I would like to make some provocative, for some maybe not provocative at all, set the scene for the discussion and debate that we can elaborate. I was going to talk about, Turkey as a model. What does it mean to Europe as this? What is this model? What does it mean to the Middle East and all that? And I changed my mind because when we talk about Taksim Square, for me and for my generation, it has a symbolic significance. And this is a very important one. I borrow this saying from feminists, personal is political. So I'll start with the political, personal, political. What does it mean to me? So I teach, yes, I cover all those areas as an academic, enlargement of the European Union, pipelines, geopolitics, but I teach critical geopolitics. So theoretically, what I'm interested in is the link between ideology and space. So Taksim Square is a space, and this is what you're doing here is also to do with space. You know, this is the century of space, and I think it was Foucault who said that if the 20th century was about history, the 21st century will be about the space. So we seek power relations or analyze power relations across the space. So I'd like to talk about Taksim Square as a spatial metaphor. What does Taksim Square particularly mean to me, and particularly, or in general, what it means to my generation? Coming from a leftist Marxist background, you know, I mean, I studied political science under military government. I keep saying this to my students, and I keep repeating. Studying political science under military government is a very interesting adventure, you know. So, yes, Taksim Square, there are lots of different manifestations of this Taksim Square as a man. Of course, it started in Gezi Park, but what does it mean? Taksim Square as a symbolic space, Taksim Square as a sort of construction of neoliberal project, Taksim Square as a symbol of republicanism. I'm going to talk about, finally maybe I'll finish, maybe I'll relate to this, the Turkish model. What does that mean? But let me start with this personal, if you like, experience. On 1st of May 1977, I was actually one of those who participated in Labor Day. I was 17 at that time, and very excited, you know, full of idealism. I haven't lost the idealism. And we were marching towards the Taksim Square, Gümüşsuyu Caddesi. And we had entered, different groups entered at different stages. I'm not going to tell you which group I belong to because I don't want to get into that. You know, Turks are very, when it comes to that, I don't want to. But before we actually entered the square, we started hearing shots coming from the buildings. Bangs, you know, boom, boom, boom, guns all over the place. I didn't personally witness because I wasn't at that moment in the Taksim Square. There was panic, there was chaos and all that. As a result of this, according to some 32, to this day, how many people exactly were killed there has not been established. Radio Istanbul said 32, this revolutionary trade union, this said 42, whatever. But numbers do not matter. People were killed. There was panic. Some shadowy figures from the top of the buildings. At that time, the tallest building, the Sular İdaresi, division of what we call that, the water supply company, and the Marmara Hotel were the tallest buildings. Apparently, according to the witnesses, some shots were fired from those buildings, and people died. Most of people actually didn't die from bullets, only 3 or 4. Most of them died because of the chaos. Armored vehicles moved in, there was a lot of noise, and again, the water cannons and all also. So we started running towards the side streets, and you know, there was complete chaos. So, and none of the perpetrators were caught. You know, to this day, actually, none of the perpetrators were caught. There are lots of theories about this, who did it, you know, some said intelligence services, some agent provocateurs, all sorts of theories are still being, you know, conspiracy theories are being produced. So, actually, it's a very, as you know, the policeman who killed recently at Sarısulup also was released. That's another telling story, you know, he's killed a bullet, he died from a bullet wound, you know, and I think the policeman was a few days ago, I don't know how many days was released. So I'd like to take this opportunity to pay a tribute to those people who have lost the workers and the students lost their lives in the Taksim Square. And again, I'd like to pay tribute to those who have lost their lives in the recent social unrest in Istanbul and other parts of Turkey. So let me move from the personal to significance, the symbolic significance of the square. You know, as squares are becoming more and more popular all over the world, you know, squares started to speak back to the power. The Tahrir Square, Taksim Square, the squares all over the place, as Paul Mason said, it's kicking off everywhere. Of course, for different reasons, for different, you know, in different contexts. I'm not going to generalize this. But square as a site has acquired a new dimension, revolutionary dimension, if you like. That Taksim Square, let me start as a symbol, is a symbol of republicanism in Turkey. I don't know whether you have been to Taksim Square, but if you go there, you will see there is Atatürk Cultural Center. You know, opera, ballet, representing the modern Turkish, Republican Turkish culture, that building. And then, I mean, there is a lot of stories attached to the Atatürk Cultural Center as well. And my colleague and friend Mehmet was telling me about it. I'm sorry I can't remember all that detail. I know you're a treasure of knowledge, but I don't know, just remind me again, or maybe in the discussions you can also talk about. But also, you know, there are two streets opening to this, İstiklal Caddesi, Independence Street, and then the Cumhuriyet Caddesi. You can see, but more importantly, there is a monument right in the middle. I don't know whether you have analyzed it very carefully. Right in the middle of this monument, the statue, Atatürk statue. You know, there are two shadowy, well, not shadowy, but dodgy guys there. Nobody really knows who they are. Russian-Turkish relations as a specialist in, I don't like that word, specialist. But as a person who's interested in Russian-Turkish relations, there are two generals, Bolshevik generals standing next to Atatürk. Did you know this? So one of them is Voroshilov Vasilyevich, and then the other one is Mikhail Fruz. They were Bolshevik generals. Actually, in the beginning of the Turkish national movement, they brought money, they morally, strategically, and financially supported the Turkish national movement. And at the special request of Atatürk, they were put there in that money. You know, the Italian sculptor called Pietro Canonica built this. And Atatürk said, I want these two figures there. And he was insistent, he's given direct instruction. So, this is the square of this Republican symbolism, you know, the Republican square. There are no mosques there, you know, there are like 80 to 90,000 mosques in Turkey and 60,000 schools, but maybe we need a big mosque there as well, I don't know. Of course I'm being sarcastic here, but it's a truly Republican place, but there are also other claims, you know, that once upon a time it was an Armenian cemetery, and then the government is trying to sort of build this replica of the Ottoman barracks, so on, and there are lots of stories. But as it stands, it's a Republican space. Remember Erdem Gündüz, who started this protest movement, passive resistance, standing man? And I was reading in one of his interviews, I think it was in one of the Greek newspapers, he says, the interviewer asks him, says, what were you doing standing there? Are you staring at anything? He said something very interesting. Standing at that threshold, he just says, he said he was looking at the symbols of the Republic. If you see him in the picture, he's looking at the Atatürk Cultural Center, the Atatürk's picture and flag and all that. So this is the symbolic significance of the square. But also, recently, Taksim Square has become a site of construction. Neoliberal site of neoliberal construction. If you're following the political events in Turkey, the government's policies, almost every other week, on a weekly basis, Erdogan comes up with a new project. This crazy project to connect the Black Seas to Marmara Sea, Third Bridge, you know, the mosque, another mosque in the Taksim Square. So this huge project, you know, these public projects. Of course, there are for political and economic reasons that he's promoting these projects. But these are actually, I mean, for instance, he says he wants to build a big mosque. He's playing a low profile at the moment, but he mentioned that he wants a big mosque there. He also, as you know, this shopping center that they were going to build on this Gezi Park, the replica of the Ottoman barracks. The significance of this, that's during the, you know, the period of Ottoman, the latest period, that it was the religious movement against the constitution started there. So they're all symbolic things. He wants to put his own stamp on this Republican space. But more importantly, he talked about the third bridge called Yavuz Selim, Sultan Selim Bridge. Even the choice of this title is an interesting one. Because if you are familiar with the Ottoman history, Yavuz Selim, Sultan Selim is actually popularly, there's still the debate about it, whether he was the slayer of the Alawites or Shiites of Anatolia, but it is perceived as the Alawite slayer, you know, massacred Alawites of Turkey. If you actually look at the Turkish foreign policy, you know, sectarian foreign policy, this makes sense. Why? They have deliberately named the bridge Yavuz Sultan Süleyman, and they're quite stubborn and adamant about it. So you can see this is like a privatization of the public space. But when Erdogan talks about the Ottoman Empire, I'm really completely puzzled by this, because I studied at Faculty of Political Science. My professors were İlber Ortaylı, we read Halil Berktay's books on Ottoman Empire. And I'm just thinking, is this the Ottoman Empire? You know, we have read, you know, we've studied. But the Ottoman Empire, Erdogan is talking as a completely different one. You know, I'm almost, I don't know, inverted Orientalism. You know, this creates this, harks back to this Ottoman image, the glorious past. And he says, Türk büyükleri. And none of them are Turkish. None of them were Turks anyway. I mean, they were all 136 of them, they are Serbian mothers, or I mean, none of them were genetically or ethnically speaking were Turkish. And there are other things you can talk about, so that he just creates this Sunni Ottoman Empire was an empire. And it was, its ideology was a Sunni ideology. These public projects can be best described as the capitalist forms of accumulation. You know, Harvey talks about accumulation by dispossession. How the public space is being, you know, the public commons are being transferred into private hands. This is what it is. But by doing this, he also wants to create this Disneyland Ottoman space, you know, almost like a Disneyland. When he talks and when you sort of, he's really nostalgic about almost, you can see, maybe he visited some museums in Europe and saw some Orientalist paintings, as you know, the glorious past, and borrows that rather than understanding his own history. I call this inverted Orientalism. So, but Çağlar Keydar actually said something very interesting. This Ottomanism is a highly selective and subjective one. Because recently Çağlar Keydar wrote this very interesting piece. He says that Ottoman state was the owner of all land. You know, that was not recognized as private. And he just says this man's trusteeship or not alienable property. So property was actually belonged to the state, Ottoman state, the public. But neoliberal AKP, on the other hand, is all happy to privatize these public assets. When it comes to multiculturalism, you know, the millet system, he's also very selective. Ottoman Empire actually recognized all other religious minorities, their property rights, as long as they paid their taxes, they left them at all. But his, again, Ottoman multiculturalism is a very highly selective and a subjective one. So, Erdogan thinks of public land as his property, and the public space, according to him, should be privatized in the true neoliberal manner with the help of this Disneyland narrative of the Ottoman history. So you can see this in all his speeches. He's trying to stamp his, like Mimar Sinan, you know, like the legacy. This is Erdogan has created this, brought back the Ottoman times to the city. Actually, Keder calls this a very interesting phrase. He defines this as retro-developmentalist discourse. Retro-developmentalist discourse. I think it's quite clever. It's true. Erdogan's discourse is not developmentalist, but it's retro-developmentalist discourse. So it's a reactionary discourse. So, and then he leaves no room for discussion, for instance. It's a top-down. Even an issue like the park, you know, the Gezi Park, is a local issue. He intervenes. He sidelines the mayor. He sidelines everybody. You know, it's in a top-down fashion. He talks about neighborhoods. You know, he was a mayor, as you know, but he's everywhere, and his approach is very authoritarian. His style is very authoritarian. So, the final point, not the final point, but that I'm going to talk about, but also I want to talk about Taksim as a public square, as a site of democracy. When politics is actually suffocated and the voice of this dissent are stifled, what happens when within the confines of the traditional political institutions, it naturally spills into the streets, you know? So democracy is not just about the parliament or the ballot boxes. Let's not fetishize. Also the public square. You know, the public square is where the production of the social relations take place, and it matters. And then the public square becomes a forum of political participation and resistance. And this is happening all over the world at the moment. I mean, what's happening in Egypt also? You know, the Tahrir Square has become a new parliament of the streets to express dissent, to express, you know, to resist the power. Also, you know, when the opposition cannot translate the demands of the dissent, demands of the young people and of opposition, you know, it's not just about the justice and development country. This also indicates that people are not happy with the opposition which exists within the parliament. So the square itself becomes a space of expression, resistance, popular resistance, and dissent. So, so you can see, you can look at the. I don't want to go. I don't want to sort of continue with this. That this Taksim Square is an important metaphor, important political, if you like, space that manifests itself in different, you know, in Turkish politics in different ways. So finally, I want to talk about this model. As you know, Turkey has been promoted as a model that whether Islam and democracy they are compatible and called Muslim democracy, whatever that is. You know, there is no such thing as Muslim democracy or Jewish democracy or whatever. Democracy is democracy. Either exists or doesn't exist. But actually this model, we can ask these questions. What does this model mean? What is it? What does it mean to Europe? And Europe is also a model for Europe, for Turkey. And what does it mean to the Middle East? What sort of model is this? Actually, it's a top-down model. It's a geopolitical model, hegemonic model. And it's endorsed in a way by geopolitical external powers. As a new, moderate, neoliberal, with some authoritarian characteristics of this model that can be exported. So these new movements, actually, this social unrest challenge this, if you like, model, this hegemonic geopolitical model from below. And it's a very interesting one. What I'm going to suggest here is that the real model has actually emerged now. You know, indeed, we have now modeled this model out of the recent social protests from below, as opposed to the top-down, externally, if you like, endorsed models for geopolitical reasons. Now, Turkey provides a model this model, the social model, if you like, from below, is a very inspiring one, an aspiring one, so for, at the same time, could be for the Middle East, even for some European countries. I don't know. As you know, there is also a crisis of democracy in Europe. I'm not here to suggest that Europe is a model for Turkey either. So, I think what we have to be really, really careful here, if I can paraphrase Alain Badiou, just said, actually, democracy, or the illusion of democracy, is much more dangerous than imperialism and capital. Because, we are up against very sophisticated power networks. And these social, if you like, movements and uprisings really matter. I think by way of conclusion, I would like to say here that, as Gramsci said, still, these forces are very, very powerful. I think we should think with the pessimism of the intellect, that things are not going to change tomorrow because of this movement, and act with the optimism of the will. So, at this, I think, it seems that there is an alternative, and we are coming out of this dystopia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tunc, for some provocative ideas, and also drawing this link between the Ottoman history and Erdogan's ideas. So we'll bring some of this up in a moment. I'd like to have Kara, if you could please.
Thank you very much. I wanted to focus on the connection, if there are any, between the Gezi Park protests and the conflicts and the power struggles that have been raging in the Middle East in particular. And I think I want to do so in the spirit of intellectual pessimism and willful optimism that Tunc just beautifully quoted here. More specifically, I'm wondering if we can assume any causality between the protests and the Justice and Development Party government's handling of regional politics. Because at first sight, it could seem as if the protests in Turkey are a fairly domestic affair. They erupted out of a seemingly local dispute over the use, or rather misuse, of a public space. They focused on the abuse of power by an elected government which has strong patriarchal and majoritarian impulses. And of the 6 core demands that the Taksim platform presented to the Turkish government on behalf of the protesters, none of them had any direct relevance to foreign policy. And yet, it's impossible to make sense of the last 5 weeks of Turkey in isolation from the regional and the international context in which Turkey is very much a part of. And this is not only because problems of democratic representation, civil liberties, rent-based urbanization, environmental degradation, or police brutality, which are at the core of the protests, are in fact some of the most urgent issues facing driving the masses and politicians around the world, from Brazil to the United States, from Egypt to China, but also because the social-political fault lines in Turkey that became fully exposed with the Gezi Park protests have been directly influenced and, in fact, aggravated by the changing geopolitical dynamics in the post-Arab Spring Middle East, and especially by the ambitious leadership agenda that the Turkish government has been pursuing in the region. So let me take the next 8 to 10 minutes trying to unpack that loaded sentence for you. 2011 was a turning point for the government of Prime Minister Erdogan, both at home and abroad. At home, this was the year when Erdogan's dominance over his own party and his party's dominance over Turkey's politics and institutions became complete. The AKP had just won a constitutional referendum allowing to rearrange, restructure the Kemalist-controlled judiciary, completely marginalized any real or potential threat to its rule from the military by putting behind bars pretty much an entire generation of offices, surpassed China in the first quarter of that year to become the world's fastest growing economy, and won a third consecutive general election victory by increasing its vote from the previous one. And all of these happened in the middle of an economic and democratic crisis in the West, and revolutionary upheaval in the Middle East, where the collapse of one secular dictator after another and the rise of Islamist movements looking up to the AKP as some sort of an inspiration seemed unstoppable. So when Prime Minister Erdogan came out to the balcony of his party headquarters in Ankara in June 2011 to deliver his victory speech to the thousands of adoring supporters, he did not just see in front of him a country whose fate he held in his own hands. He also saw a vast region, basically expanding from one end of the Eastern Mediterranean to the other. And this we know for a fact, because in that famous victory speech, Prime Minister Erdogan drew a mental map of this imagined realm, where he said, "Believe me, Sarajevo won today as much as Istanbul. Beirut won as much as Izmir. Damascus won as much as Ankara. Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin, the West Bank, Jerusalem won as much as Diyarbakir." Of course, this was an obvious geographic reference, as Tunc also mentioned, to the former Ottoman territories. But whereas the Ottoman Empire, as we spoke already, was a multi-religious and a multinational entity, Erdogan's reference had a distinctly Islamic emphasis. And it was within the confines of this Islamicity that it was multinational. In other words, there was an embrace of Turks, Arabs, Kurds, and Muslim people of the Balkans, but not really any mention of the non-Muslim communities within this domain. And it's from this point on that Erdogan really started governing Turkey as if he was running an empire, in the sense that the AKP's regional policy became inseparable from its domestic policy. At home, the government invested fully and openly in efforts to transform Turkey's physical and social landscape into an image that combined the dream of unfettered growth with imperial nostalgia and a conservative interpretation of Sunni morality. Erdogan envisioned a Turkey that would be pious, industrious, and very much aware of its grandness. And he wanted both its buildings and its citizens to reflect these characteristics. The government's regional policy also followed pretty much the same pattern. It became even more proactive than it was before, getting deeply involved in conflicts from Libya all the way to Syria. Representatives of the government started touring the post-revolutionary North African countries like colonial officials, and the Prime Minister himself like a triumphal regent. And partly in connection with the growing sectarian nature of the wider geopolitical divide, the Turkish foreign policy assumed an increasingly visible pro-Sunni tendency, openly supporting Sunni leaders and Sunni Islamist movements against Shia-dominated governments and movements in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and less directly in Iran. A quick look at the images from the party's 2012 Congress in Istanbul will reveal not only all of these characteristics in full display, but will also expose the degree to which foreign and domestic politics became one around this time of the AKP governments. In that Congress, in front of a giant banner of the party's official election slogan, Great Nation, Great Power, Target 2023, we saw Egypt's Mohamed Morsi, Hamas's Ismail Haniyeh, and Kurdistan regional governments Mesut Barzani singing praises to Prime Minister Erdogan and condemning Syria's Bashar al-Assad. On the other hand, quite telling of the sad state of the Turkish-EU relationship, the only high-profile European dignitary present at that Congress was the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. And crucially, during this period, foreign policy strategists and pundits here in this country and also in the United States actively supported and promoted Turkey as a leader and model to the region. Again, this was a mainly pragmatic move. At a moment of great uncertainty in the Middle East, Turkey once again seemed like a vital bridge between the rising Islamist movements on the one hand and Western powers who had limited ideological appeal on these movements on the other hand. And then there was a moderating effect of the Turkish model on the streets of revolutionary countries, in the sense that the Turkish model represented just enough change that was strategically acceptable and even preferable to the Western security establishment. Popularly backed, Islamist but only moderately so, pro-market, pro-NATO, ready to burn the bridges with Syria and Iran, and pragmatic enough to make peace with Israel. But of course, this package was promoted by embellishing the government's liberal democratic credentials and its ability, perceived ability, to effect meaningful change across its borders. Both of which, of course, were fast becoming an illusion by that point. Syria, in particular, has turned from a grand ambition into a bitter disappointment for the AKP. Against all of the government's hopes and expectations, Bashar al-Assad held on to power, and as the civil war dragged on with growing sectarian violence and radicalism. And Turkey started feeling the heat through a mass refugee influx, loss of lucrative trade revenues, a revived Kurdish militancy, border skirmishes, and rising tensions between its own religious communities, and particularly unrest among the Alevi and Alawite populations of Turkey, especially in the province of Antakya on the Syrian border. So in other words, while Turkey attempted to manipulate the dynamics in Syria, the Syrian conflict started affecting the dynamics inside of Turkey. And the failures and frustrations experienced abroad translated into tensions at home. And over the past year and a half, as these were happening, at home, the government's social, urban, and foreign policies started drawing more scathing and more widespread criticisms, even from former supporters of the Justice and Development Party. And the government's reaction to this became more heavy-handed and more intolerant. In a sense, the AKP started displaying all the traditional reflexes of the patriarchal state that we long associated with the Kemalist guardians. Create their sacred symbols and taboos. Protect them with the wording of the law. Accuse critics of treachery. Label protesters as terrorists. And suppress all legitimate dissent by using brute force. Not surprisingly, we soon found ourselves in the middle of a vicious cycle of growing oppression and growing resistance. And during this process, we started seeing very diverse political groups, often with very clashing interests, slowly come together in their shared opposition, not only just to the governing party, but specifically to Prime Minister Erdogan, including hardline leftists, liberals, social democrats, environmentalists, LGBT activists, Alevis, Kurds, anti-capitalists, as well as secular nationalist Turks. And in the end, it was these groups who made up the political basis of Gezi Park protests. Gezi was the moment when this vicious cycle finally stopped and the tensions poured out and exploded. It came after horrific clashes in Istanbul on May Day, followed by the worst terrorist attack in the country's history on the Syrian border in the town of Reyhan, which killed 51 citizens. The government's response to this atrocity was suppressing local protests and imposing a nationwide media blackout, preventing discussions from taking place. But it proved impossible to do the same when protests erupted in Turkey's most globally visible public space, Taksim Square. Much to the surprise of a lot of people in the West who were still seeing Turkey as an island of stability in one of the more troubled regions of the world, as Jimmy Carter once famously described Pahlavi Iran on the eve of revolution. To its credit, the government took one very bold and pragmatic step earlier this year to turn the tides towards its favor, both at home and abroad. It launched full-scale peace talks with the Kurds, with the hope of winning them over in order to ease the tensions at home and also expand Turkey's strategic depth, as the famous saying goes, further into Syria, Iraq, and Iran, which have considerable Kurdish minorities. This was an unexpected and actually a brave move that also won the support of a lot of the government's critics. That said, the process has been built on two problematic pillars. First, the rationale for Turkish-Kurdish unity has been presented through the idea of an Islamic Brotherhood. And secondly, it involved a peace for power bargain, whereby Kurds have been expected to support Erdogan's drive to establish a system of super-presidency, replacing the current parliamentarian system, in exchange for being granted cultural and political rights. What the Gezi protests have shown is that the straitjacket of a unifying and hegemonic Sunni identity pushed on by a patriarchal authority is just too tight for Turkey's modern communities, just as the previous Kemalist straitjacket was too tight for Turkey. When you try to unite the people under the umbrella of the majority religion, you alienate other religious minorities and secular-minded people. When you try to impose your will through abusing democratic institutions, you risk losing your democratic legitimacy. The only way to build the stable and self-confident society that the AKP officials have been talking about involves producing an entirely new social contract and a constitution that strengthens Turkey's democratic checks and balances, safeguards its civil liberties, cultural rights, and lifestyle choices, protects its public interests, facilitates political deliberation, and transforms its system from majoritarianism into pluralistic democracy. Perhaps for the first time in Turkey's modern history, for the first time that I can remember, there's an overwhelming demand for such a constitutional arrangement, for such a new social contract in both the west and the east of the country. And perhaps for the first time in decades, a popularly elected government whose own constituents suffered from systematic discrimination and chauvinism in recent past has the power to cater to these demands. Unfortunately, every single day that it turns more inward-looking and more autocratic, Erdogan's government is letting this historic opportunity slip away. But it's okay. I don't see it as a tragic ending. In fact, I don't see this as an ending at all. I am here today full of optimism, because from its amazing park forums to the secular middle-class Turks' belated awakening of their Kurdish siblings' long suffering, to the absence of even the specter of a military intervention, there are a lot of positives that came out of Gezi Park that can be brought forward. We know that true democracies are not built overnight. They take long-term struggles and incredible sacrifices. We also know that rights are not given, they're taken. So for those of us who yearn to live like a tree, solitary and free, and like a forest in colorful harmony, I'd say this is just the beginning. The struggle will continue.
Thank you for a very optimistic picture. So I'll ask Alex to make a few remarks about just drawing some links about what's happening or what has been happening in Brazil, and then we'll open up for discussion.
I wanted to show a picture, but I think it's going to take a while to turn on. How can I follow up such a beautifully put presentations and poetically put presentations as well, and very thorough, and I'm not trying to reflect so deeply on the Turkish context, but I would merely state or narrate a series of events that's been taking place in Brazil, and I would like to draw some of those connections between the narration of those events. So I think some of the stories that have been put forward here in a very interesting, eloquent way. I think I will be talking about this trajectory of resistance that's been taking place in Brazil, and to some extent talking about the negotiations between growth and redistribution. In the case of Brazil, has been a very prominent debate that has been taking place for many other places. And in between this, I think as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about the use of the national identity. You know? In Brazil, we went through a modernistic phase in the beginning of the 60s, where there was a very strong drive towards being Brazilian, and we had the 70s in terms of military regime, where we've been trying to construct this idea of being Brazilian, and suddenly we were made to believe that we are all a perfectly harmonized system of multiple identities that are under a very positivistic umbrella of order and progress. That's our flag now, states all over the world, as we can see often in protests, strong words associated to order and progress. And I'd like to bring back this debate afterwards. Well, where do we start the story in the context of Brazil? I would like to start in the 1990s, where in São Paulo there was a mayor called Luísa Erundina, and she was a Workers' Party mayor. And she decided to tackle one of the key elements in terms of what she thought was the key entry point to try to democratize cities in Brazil, which was transport. She thought that by making transport free, so that people do not pay the tariffs, they would be able to actually move around the cities, and that would have a direct effect on property, on land prices, and that would generate a sense of mobility, that we can start unpacking the commodification of cities, the way in which the cities have become polarized and segregated. So she, together with our Minister of Transport, proposed a system where taxes will be collected, so property taxes, and they would be subsidizing private sector or the transport sector, so that people would not be paying for the tariffs. Actually, financially, it made total sense. The private sector would be happy. They would be guaranteed their income. In terms of the public, there will be guarantee in terms of the use of the transport. There will be reduction in the costs because reduction of the use of cars. There will be a reduction in terms of cost of the use of roads. Collective system will be prioritized. So financially and from a very managerial perspective, it actually made all sense. But of course, this idea did not run very far because it found a very strong political reaction against it and stopped. From then on, this idea actually started being picked up by different groups. And the World Social Forum in 2007, a movement was created called the Movement of Free Pass. Now, pass in Portuguese means also trajectories, it means also free, and it's about passing through. So it's a very interesting, it's not only the pass in terms of the tariffs, it's in terms of free transportation. The Movimento Passe Livre was created then. This movement starts becoming very proactive. They have a certain constitution around the horizontality. A lot of young people have been involved into that, people that have been involved in a lot of activism in Brazil for many years. And they start consolidating the agenda. We see protests popping up in different cities. When the municipalities start thinking about increasing the prices of transport, public transport, then the protests would arise. It arrived in Salvador, it arrived in Rio de Janeiro before, Florianopolis, a series of other cities that actually those protests emerged. Most of the time labeled by the media as protests, as disruptions to the city, as criminal activities that were taking place, and rapidly those things will just phase out and we take away from the media. So we go forward, we go to June 2013. One of those, the municipal authorities of São Paulo decided to avoid some public procedures to change the prices of transport, and they tried to go through the back door and they tried to move the prices by 20 cents. There will be a 20 cents increase of the price of transport. We have 2, 3, depending, 4, 5,000 people in the streets of São Paulo protesting against this increase of price and the way in which it was. As in other protests, the whole media started going through the social media, people went to the streets and they started reacting to this. At the same time, we are also talking about a scenario that the PT government have been in power for 4, 8, now this is the third mandate of the Workers' Party in Brazil, where the right-wing parties have seen no way into actually political power. And we are talking about another elections coming up in 2014, and where Dilma, the current president, has actually been very, very strongly in the post for many years. So politically, we're talking about probably a very solid future of Workers' Party for many years in Brazil to come. This moment, the police react to this protest extremely violently. So we see shots, we see films of people being shoot towards them. We see also, not to say that the police have not been acting strongly against other social groups. We have a very strong militarization process of upgrading in the favelas in Rio, because we're trying to clean up the slums in Rio so that it's secure for our guests to come, and we are just evicting some of the gang, the trafficking to other parts of the country so that they can have a holiday and then when they can come back after. So there's a process of militarization of the slums as a means of intervention and improving the quality of life. So that type of militarization and impact has been very common in Brazil. But for the first time, we see, for many years, police attacking. And then we had pictures, and I wanted to show one of the pictures. There we had very similar pictures that were disseminated through the social media that actually happened in Turkey. In that moment, a series of comparisons started emerging. Boom. In one of the drawings that we wanted to show, it was precisely making this comparison between what was happening in Turkey and what was happening in Brazil. First reaction from the right-wing media was to condemn again this protest. People were acting criminal activities, outraged. There was a very strong emphasis on one of the very strong. At 8 o'clock, Brazil has one big media corporation called Globo. At 8 o'clock, there was a pronouncement from one of these news commentaries that actually said those guys don't have anything in their minds. They are young, without any ideals, and they are just causing trouble. Basically, it's a waste of time. The next day, the same guy goes into the public radio and says, sorry, I did something totally wrong. This is actually a very good idea. From one day to another, we start seeing the tone of the media changing completely from criminalizing social movements to actually, oh, wait a minute, there's a very interesting opportunity here. If we start supporting this, we can actually stabilize the Workers' Party that have been for many years here, and we can push different agendas, not the agenda of the right to the city, not the agenda to actually democratize it, but let's bring corruption. We haven't been talking about corruption very much, so let's actually think we should be fighting for corruption. And a series of different agendas, but very general, not very specific at all, started being utilized and pushed through the right-wing mainstream media of Brazil, which became the dominant. At that moment, a certain thing, oh, my friends in Spain told me a very similar story. There was something that happened in the movement in Spain that was precisely the same type of opportunistic appropriation. So we see this upheaval, and then suddenly the government responds in São Paulo and Rio by saying, we're not going to make the tariffs up. We're going to not make the 20 cents, it's not going to go up. People go to the streets, they take their Brazilian flags, they wave the Brazilian flags. I went to the demonstrations here in London. They shout. People didn't know what to shout for. There is a certain, we haven't been in protest before, so what we do? Oh, we sing the national anthem, that's what we all know, right? So we hold together and we sing the national anthem. And then we're saying, there's chants like, oh, we're proud to be Brazilian, and then, oh, we're Brazilian. And suddenly, the sense of being Brazilian, and of course I have to remind you, Confederations Cups is taking place at the same time. Of course I haven't been telling you that part of the story, where there has been for the last, 4 or 5 years, very much present in the public debate, not like in England that was a marginal debate, but in Brazil it was a very prominent debate about the corruption, about how FIFA became a state within the states of Brazil, how Romário, the Brazilian footballer, well known, used this to become, so there was all these things happening. Confederations Cups happens, and then Brazilian footballers start associated with this idea. The national anthem is played in national television, just before they start the game. The national anthem is played just halfway through, and the whole stadium continues singing the national anthem all the way through as a way of showing solidarity to what's happening outside the football stadium. So there's this kind of umbrella idealism of nationalism, of the idea of being Brazilian, that starts to make some sort of dangerous, homogeneous idea of change. So then this starts coming up, the response, people go to the streets to celebrate. Great, 20% is there, the 20 cents is not going to go up. People take their flags, the flags of their party, of their social movements, they go to the streets, they get a crowd that starts throwing stones on them, that starts hitting them, that says, we are not party-oriented here. This is a non-party movement. Get out, don't use. And then suddenly the critical media that was actually trying to use, saying this is a great thing that's happened, suddenly, wow, what's going on here? This is a moment of crisis in terms of, similar as in Spain it happened, and the same way that there was suddenly a kind of appropriation of right-wing ideology. In that moment, the whole Brazilian critical social media blog starts saying, let's go back to the spaces of dialogue. Suddenly throws Twitters, blogs saying, let's go back to where we were making dialogues, let's return to the neighborhoods, let's go to space. And go to the spaces that we were talking about in the beginning, let's talk about them. Let's talk about my neighborhood, about my place. Again, the story of Spain reminds me a lot of how the movements in Spain started decentralized from very centralized ideas to neighborhoods. So there was this idea of return to spaces of of dialogue. From there, the government responded by saying, well, we're going to make a referendum. Okay, we make a political reform. Dilma came to the national television. She had a unique opportunity to finally connect to the demands of Dilma was herself fighting against military regime. She was in the streets. She was fighting herself against violence in the streets. And for many, she's been in the political arena. She hasn't been able to connect to people in terms of their demands, in terms of their visions. This was her moment. National television. She was going to make a statement. And she started by talking about order and progress. She missed it. Basically, she had total miss. And she's now starting to build a referendum. There is a proposal for a referendum, which is to be positive in terms of bringing about political reform that's necessary, the way that campaigns are financed, in terms of the more political, profound structures in which we're talking about. But we are not really talking about the production of the city yet. We're talking about underlying political reform. As a result, now we have less activism in the streets in terms of this movement. But today, it's actually the day for national struggle. The unions, the social movements got together after a certain calm down. They said, let's come back to the streets and let's repoliticize the streets of Brazil in the way that we've been doing historically, actually thinking about influencing structures. And today there's protests going all over Brazil. And there's strikes, there was bus strikes, there's different strikes of different groups, the unions are getting mobilized, the landless movement is coming to different cities, and today it's happening all over the place. However, I was looking this morning into the news, again, we see a very strong current. They are not protests again, they are disruption of city functions. No? That's how they've been portrayed again in the media. So we actually see a redefinition of what used to be before useful for some bringing some agendas forwards. Now they have been again seen as some sort of barrier. And then we come back to this idea, I think, of what's happening now, the illusion of democracy. And I think that speaks very, very well to what's happening in Brazil. We still have probably a democratizing moment. I think there's a moment that democracy is put into contest, and there is a certain debate: do we need parties? Do we not need parties? That's something that's happening a lot in the debate in Brazil at the moment. Probably not going to go very far in terms of actually challenging party systems. However, there is a debate about direct democracy and deepening democratic practices, which is very important about changing the configuration of the political system. However, on the other hand, I see very minute changes in terms of the production of the city. There was one statement yesterday by saying that the mayor of São Paulo is not going to build a huge tunnel, that they were going to build and evict 8,000 inhabitants, and that was the major type of success that's been happening in terms of policy and practice. But we had in the Brazilian government enough constitutional amendments to allow for more progressive ways of dealing with the city. We have the statute of the city, we have housing programs that were very, very interesting, and we still see a mode of production of the city that is very private oriented towards focusing growth rather than distribution. So I guess really what we're talking here, I think again in the same tone of your pessimistic but again optimistic aspect that you've been describing in the case in Turkey, I think Brazil is living a very similar scenario in terms of disillusionment with Workers' Party, disillusionment with the reaction. I think so far we hoped for a much more open, even if Castells said that Dilma has been the best president in terms of reacting to the popular demands, but we still yet to see if this is going to translate in different ways of producing the city in a more democratic way, the way we're going to be revitalizing the city centers, if we're going to work off social movements, or if we're going to be talking about private partnerships in privatization of public spaces, as it's been happening in public. We still yet to see if these things are going to be consolidated, and this is not being debated. And I think that's the problem. The agenda has been hijacked to a different realm, which is being far away from actually the changes that's going to bring about more democracy at cities where people are living at the moment. So that's
So thank you. I'd like to open up to some discussion, and if you have any, especially sort of, I think the idea of debate and bringing forward some maybe different opinions, different perspectives on what is happening in Turkey or anything with Brazil would be very much appreciated. So I'll open it up and maybe we'll take a couple of questions at once. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Is it because I'm standing up? My name is Hassan from Oxford University Academic Fellow. I just wanted to make 2 points. It's very interesting to hear from somebody about hegemony. And I think I'll just remind you when Ibrahim Gerçek took power, so Melih Gerçek took power, and Ankara changed the symbol from the right sun to mosque. So this hegemony, I think, is reflected very deep in Gramsci's theory of hegemony through symbols and creating discourse to recreate their own images. My main point is regarding Gezi and Turkey. It's very close to me, both countries. Probably very interesting to hear it. I was in Amazonia, very deep, where there's no internet or any phone, whatever, and I was just sitting in a cafe waiting for my friend. And the TV, people like stuck on the TV screen and watching it. The places are very like, where do I go? It's just like Istanbul. And it's actually Istanbul. It's the most famous soap opera, Brazilian soap opera, I think in prime time was Salva Jorge. Probably most of Brazilians would know. It's taking place in Turkey, like Brazilians living in Istanbul and creating that as if Brazilian people kidnapped and lived in Istanbul. It's amazing. In the middle of Amazonia, can you imagine? But I wanted to make my point about the differences and similarities about Brazil and Turkey. First of all, Brazil, you mentioned Sao Paulo. No? Sao Paulo is actually being run by maybe 1,000 years by right-wing mayor. So I would be really careful to reflect this on the PT party, the Workers' Party in Brazil, because the way in which that the Workers' Party have responded, totally different than the way in which Turkey responded, the government of Turkey responded to the events. Also, the events in Brazil, of course, it started autonomous and then maybe beyond parties. Still, in the last 10 years, most of the policies have been implemented. They're not like neoliberal policies. Like in Turkey, most of the problem actually started, what Karabekir was trying to say, within the regional context, but also there is a domestic context, which the Turkish economy is depending on foreign direct investment. The moment that foreign direct investment stops, Turkey has to do construction buildings like this. And therefore, Turkish government cannot stop not building. It will keep building as long as there's this crisis going on. So the main difference is one, in Brazil, not neoliberal policies actually created. Maybe the politics might have a problem, but PT at least responded trying to understand the demands of the people. We may lose the moment when she said on TV, but at least she, like we did some transformations in Turkey, totally different. There's no change. The government is more and more suppression. Today, Turkey is a country where a 90-year-old boy was beaten to death. This is the difference. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll take one more.
First of all, just one little tidbit of information that the construction sector in Turkey in the past year has shrunk 14% in growth. I mean, it was 15% last year, it's 1% this year, so that's sort of a dying out sector of the economy that's sort of occupied most part of the growth anyway. And this fantasy of growth is also slowed down considerably. So this, European fantasy that Karabekir also alluded to in terms of sort of promoting Turkey as a model is itself a constructive sort of thing. But my question is also to Karabekir. You mentioned the demand for a new social contract, and I was wondering how you would articulate the demand for local governance and autonomy within that context.
How I would articulate local governance within that context?
Because there's been a historical demand for local governments, and with the Kurdish peace process going on, there's of course a demand for autonomy, not necessarily full autonomy, but at least sort of a more local form of governance. And I would I would be curious to know what you think about how that finds a place within the new social contract that you mentioned.
We'll come back to that.
Thank you very much. My name is Akkoyunlu from Durham University. My question would be probably combined of the two both questions. I really like to hear actually from you guys to define the character of the Gezi movement, and so-called maybe postmodern upheavals, because I think that also led me to ask question of the. Before this question, I need to go back to the actual Gramsci's debate. I think it's a debate ongoing on, which is this war of Turks, the struggle between two hegemonic candidates. On the one side, an Islamist, traditional, nationalist, new dominant power. On the other side, secular, modernist, Kemalist, old dominant power. So it is really the hegemonic struggle of the Turks. If we leave, I mean, for a while, this debate of hegemonic power, if we go back, if it's a democratic struggle, which is also the ground parallel with the EU accession process, then what's exactly the role of the EU and plus internal dynamics Kurds in this, let's say again, historical / democratic law? How much opportunity space the Kurds find in this Gezi public sphere, and how much opportunity space the Kurds find in this new historical bloc, let's say, which is very important for the Turkish politics, I guess, because the first time the mainstream Turkish identity demanding something from their own government, and they actually brutally oppressed by their own police forces. Thank you.
Okay.
So are you directing this question to all of us? Or?
Thing to you.
I mean, yeah, if you like.
Okay, first of all, I mean, if I understood your question correctly, I really don't like this dichotomy, secularists versus, how can I say, political Islam.
It's not mine, it's going on debate, so I just want to ask.
There's no such dichotomy because it's much more complex than that. As you know, in Taksim Square there were also anti-Muslim, anti-capitalist Muslims, and the other day they did their own iftar, yes?
Yeah.
So there are also, even, not many, some AKP supporters in the square. Some of them even have written letters to the Prime Minister saying that you've gone too far, you know. So it's not, I actually disagree with this, you know, the secularism versus Turkey consists of these two monolithic blocks, secularists and Islamists.
That's what I refer to the democratic.
Yeah, and also the context, you know, all these things, I think we should avoid generalizations. All these social movements take place within specific contexts, and they take specific forms and shapes. I mean, I actually was interviewed by a Brazilian newspaper, a Brazilian something, I don't remember, before what happened in Brazil, and I was talking about, they were asking me, this was in English, I don't know how they translated, oh, is this a Turkish spring? Or Occupy movement, you know? I just said, let's not season this, you know, there's nothing that's Turkish spring, Arab summer, the Russian winter, or something like that. This is Turkish Çapulcu movement, you know, the looters. And yeah, that's it, because the Turkish social movement takes place within a specific context against this narrowing down political space, anger, and bottled up anger, if you like, you know, people are demanding, because the opposition also couldn't translate the demands of the young people. And all of a sudden the government looked old, out of touch with the young, you know, just said that this social media, Erdogan said, is a menace. But he effectively used social media during his election campaign. So again, you have this selective, if you like, modernity issue there, that when it suits him, he's modern, and it doesn't, he harks back to all these pre-modern periods. I don't know. So it's highly selective and ambiguous.
Would you agree then that this is I think that what Kara was saying is that this is a push for a new kind of democracy in Turkey?
Could be. It is too early to say that. I think it wasn't Mao, but Mao's. He just said it's too early to speak. You know, when he was asked, "What do you think? What do you have?" Yeah, he said, "No, it's too early to decide about French Revolution." You know, it took centuries for French Revolution to settle down what sort of structures are going to come out. So now this is my political science hat I'm wearing here. You know, when you say, "Oh, revolution," what is revolution? Let's define this. Revolution is the complete transformation of society and then guided by a certain ideology. That's not happening until we are seeing the first early signs of legitimacy crisis. I mean, when Gramsci talks about hegemonic blocks, he again doesn't see them as like monolithic blocks. He talks about coalitions and alliances formed. He talks about war of maneuver, the war of positional. It's highly sophisticated, you know. You keep reading it and reinterpreting it. It's very, very rich, you know, literature there. I'm not suggesting here that I'm completely, you know, absorbed that, but it's a huge thing. It's a very interesting thing. The way, you know, what sort of political formation will come out of this? We don't know yet, you know. But what I would say here is that I object to this secularist versus, you know, Islamist kind of dichotomy. Yeah.
And Kara, do you want to?
Yeah, just a few words on that, and I'll come back to you later. I couldn't agree more in the sense that I also reject the secularist versus Islamist dichotomy, but also realize that not only that, but the whole idea of the Turkish Spring or Occupy movements, these are labels that people put out there either with the intention of appropriating a movement, appropriating an event, a process, or trying to relate to them. In the second sense, when some smart Twitterati kids in the Gezi Park put the hashtag Occupy before Gezi, all of a sudden the issue which was off anyone's radars outside of even the confines of Taksim Square exploded on, you know, international Twitter scene, and this is how the Americans really caught on to it, because all of a sudden they said, "Oh, and the Occupy movement is going on." So there are obvious active purposes for, you know, reducing dynamics to sound bites and hashtags, but academically speaking, they're very dangerous. And this is not only for the Turkish case, but also for the Egyptian case. I would like to say that, perhaps not as an academic, but as people who are engaged in creating those narratives, we have you know, an active duty to try to refute these false dichotomizations. Because at the end of the day, traditional versus secularist, or Islamist versus secularist in the case of Egypt, is used perhaps to legitimize the military coup. You see, another power, the power doesn't really change hand. It remains with the hegemons. It needs to have to do with power and representation. We need to basically take a principled and inclusive and pluralistic approach to power. And in a sense, I think that Gezi Park protests maintained that stance quite successfully. That, of course, there was always this debate over otherizing. That, you know, the uneducated, ignorant supporters of Prime Minister Erdogan, what do they know? And there was a lot of mocking going on as well. But then there was a reaction, unlike the extent that I saw in the Turkish society, the secular middle classes in previous years, saying that no, we can't do that anymore, because they also do that to us. And then we create these polarizations that are very difficult to get over. And we need to basically oppose the idea of holding power illegitimately, or using legitimate power for illegitimate ends. And this has nothing to do with the person in place or the government in place. Whoever replaces that person, we should, you know, use the same dichotomy. That would be my answer. And quickly, Lara, I actually wanted to say a word or two about the issue of local governance, because that goes to the very heart of Turkey's democratic representation issue. Turkey is an obsessively centralized country. Everything has been for decades decided and shipped out from Ankara. You know, to the extent that it's ridiculous, and especially when nowadays, if it's something, an issue that is of particular importance to Prime Minister Erdogan, he actually does it himself. Like, you know, okay, we'll put the mosque there and build the bridge there, and we throw away the master plan that people worked on for years. This is especially so, part of the reason is because of the Kurdish boogeyman. I mean, this has been used, the Kurdish issue has been used as a scare tactic to maintain that power, centralized power. So when we say the Kurdish issue and Turkey's democratization are inseparable, in fact, all of the issues, all of the issues of democratic governance, representation, anything you want, are in that package that we call the Kurdish issue, in the most intense way, including local governance. And definitely, it has to be a symbiotic way of both, you know, negotiating and trying to establish a dialogue to resolve the core aspects of the Kurdish issue in order to be able to get to the localization in a kind of democratic, accepted democratic standards of local governance and representation. It needs to be a symbiotic process. That's why.
Good, thank you. Jenna?
And I'll try to add to that. Actually, Alex would be a good person to maybe comment on how it's done in Brazil. As far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, it's constitutionally allowed or dictated that local governance processes are strengthened, like participatory budgeting, or processes to put feedback into certain plans. Participatory budgeting is basically a mechanism where a certain neighborhood gets allocated a certain budget and then they can decide what to do with it. And that in Brazil is constitutionally, right, set forward. And if you look at the Istanbul plan of 2008, and where's Amash? He'd know better. But if you scroll to the last page, there's like a tiny paragraph that essentially says social justice, but there's nothing institutional in it. It's all about education and creating job opportunities. So, clearly they haven't read I Was There and Young. The DPU kind of injected it into my brain. These are things that could be provided with what Kara called a new social contract or a constitution that allows for deliberative processes. That was myself.
Actually, I think it goes back to the point before. I think the history of Brazil, while having institutional arrangements that are opening spaces for more democratic practices, what we do see is a continued utilization of public resources for private gains, and that is the big question here, right? I mean, we do have institutional frameworks, but what we see is when you look at building construction industry in Brazil, the money has been pumping into that building construction industry with enough stories for us to actually be, supporting grassroots initiatives for construction of housing. We decided to invest in huge money on high-rise buildings in the outskirts of cities, where what we end up doing is gentrification in the major cities of the country. So we do have these institutional arrangements, but how do we actually make this change and shift in the structural conditions in which that operates? I think is that the big question that the Brazilian country can actually bring forward to the world. And we cannot only think about these institutional arrangements, democratic practices. We need to change the way we do things.
Interesting, the parallels on construction, in this role in this. Yes.
While discussing and thinking about the parallelism between the Brazil issue and the Turkish issue, we are Turkish issue. I think there are certain differences, but our friend what he said is there is a right-wing neoliberal politics in Turkey and left-wing more social politics in Brazil, which I don't agree with from this perspective that we are in a global context of capital, and the relations are much more binded to each other and interacted with each other. So, for example, the president of the Brazil is socialist and the prime minister is from the Workers' Party, but there is no way that they should make the socialist policies implemented in Brazil, because you cannot be socialist in one country without these stereotypes. same kind of relation with other countries, and especially financially. So my question is, when you compare it not only with Brazil, but also with the Occupy movement, which Kara didn't make any links or relations, I see this more like linked to each other, because this is like for the first time, maybe after the 60s, not only the workers, not the low economical class movement, but this time more like middle classes are for the first time trying to change the system or trying to ask that the legitimacy of the system. And they are trying to destroy not only the government's politics, but also the democratic system as a whole, which they don't see is really democratic at all. So direct democracy is one community, and I think the transport system is also common between Turkey and Brazil, because this street gas issue is has a long history for Brazil. But in Turkey, you know, the shopping malls are a part of the urban design, which is more valid for the vehicles or car transport, private transport, while the people are occupying the places and just blocking the traffic. And when I was in Istanbul and Ankara, whenever the traffic was like blocked by the occupying movement, police said we will intervene. So the traffic was like a sign for this conflict, even in Turkey. So I think there are more commonalities, in the occupying movement, in this movement, and the Arab Spring, which is a total a cry for the people towards the system, but we still get the theory of itself yet. So can we talk a bit more about possible linkages?
Yeah, okay, great. We'll come back in this yet.
I just wanted to kind of make a very pedantic riff here. Actually, sort of following on the parallelisms between Turkey and Brazil. Unfortunately, the pictures disappeared, but anyway, it's okay. You mentioned, Brazilian friend mentioned, no, it's okay. You mentioned that the flag had Ordem e Progresso.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is derived from the Brazilian intellectuals' exchanges with the positivist movement in Paris in the 19th century. It so happens, different intellectuals, young Turks, exchanging with the Paris positivists, some of them also involved in the Paris Congress at one stage, called their party Unity and Progress. And that's an important riff because it says something about the nature of the modernism in the two countries. That's one thing. And as Tunc was saying, I'd like just to say something to him about the semiotics of Apsan. It's a suggestion. I think you should, as you told me earlier on today, the concept liminal space really does apply to Taksim Square because it has been the gateway to the European quarter, Pera. And it's quite ironic that Pera, the European quarter of the Ottoman Empire, was then called Istiklal Caddesi. Independence Street. And Taksim itself became, as you very eloquently put it, a kind of a political theater from Voroshilov to Ya Taksim, Ya Ölüm, again playing the words, we either split Cyprus into two or we die. So it became a part of a theater and identity. And of course, as you said, May 1977. And the sort of last thing which I want to say is that Perry Anderson, coming back to Brazil, and what little I know about Brazil now is derived from my sort of casual reading of Perry Anderson in the sort of article which wrote. And it's basically that PT had to buy into the neoliberal parameters, but effectively used the strategy of basic needs 1970s, 80s, further developed it and did deliver to its constituency. Just very basic things like food, clean water, etc. And that is the basis of its support. That's my understanding of the PG. Not that it's a kind of a revolutionary party, but it's better than the ANC in South Africa in that sense.
I'm in the unusual position of not being any kind of specialist but a journalist. I'm the editor of a journal, and I'm at the moment working on what am I going to write in my next editorial as these reports come in from my colleagues in Brazil, Greece, Turkey, and so on. And the Turkish one says, too early to say. But the others are saying something, but the three questions that interest me, and I just raise this because they're questions I would like to see taken further. And should I say that I found this a very valuable presentation today by everyone. Thank you so much. Is first of all, what do we learn from the occupations in Gezi Park and in Athens? And maybe in America, but I haven't gone into it. And it does seem I am prepared to think about the word revolution. I think it's in the air of people saying, there must be something else. As several people say, it can't just be private initiative, it can't just be the latest mix of the public and the private. We've done that, or if we haven't done it, other countries have done it. Are we really going to talk about that? So I think there is a deep curiosity. I mean, one of my colleagues in Istanbul said that the thing that really excited him each time he went down to Gezi Park was he was surprised, continually surprised, what people were saying to him. Any of the things he'd expected people to be saying, they weren't saying. And it does greatly interest me, this experience in the two occupations I know about, of people trying to build, in effect, a mini city. That you have to bring in the doctors, you have to have the medical supplies, you have to have the electricity generators. It's not just that you have to have, the more familiar things of how do we discuss in public. We've heard a lot about that. But this idea that you have to put all these skills together to build a little alternative society. Of course, it's smashed after a few weeks, but I think it's still there. So that's one of the things that really is interesting, which you haven't talked about today, I think, much. And my second implication from that is, sorry, I most agree with what you said, but I'm disagreeing with you at this point. I think our job is not just to produce narratives, which was your point, which I agree is tremendously important. Some of our contributors are very good at the theory, but they're not very good at producing narratives. But our duty is actually to explore other revolutionary alternatives. Not in the kind of intellectual way in which we too often do it by, lots of talk of Gramsci and lots of talk of Foucault and lots of talk of other people, which again some of our contributors do. But saying, what is the model? What would have to be done? And that brings me to my final point of interest. As I say, I'm mentioning these 3 points of interest because I would like to continue the dialogue with some of you if I can. Is where does the countryside come in all this? Which we have to talk about.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do is give each of you a chance to have a last reaction on any of these points, maybe on the. I also had that question about the countryside and the economies, and then we'll
Well, let me start by saying, from my own experience, I'm sure Mehmet and others, my generation, will relate to this. In our time, we knew where we stand. We had the party, we had the ideology. We disagreed on where to start the revolution, whether from the countryside or urban guerrilla or whatever. Yes, it was clear cut. And I find these movements fascinating in the sense that they are explicit about what they're against, but it's difficult to analyze, what they're for. There is no political program. As they say, we are non-partisan. Okay, that doesn't mean they're not political because outcomes of what they're doing is very political. And actually, one guy asked this very clever question: what happens? You know, what if you want to measure whether this is a revolution or not? What happens after people leave the squares? This is exactly what this is all about. What happens? I mean, not much has changed since people. There's here and there also. I mean, Occupy movements were very localized. Wall Street, St. Paul's, or whatever. In Turkey, what happened was not localized. It started as a Gezi Park thing, and then Istanbul, Ankara, small towns. I mean, Hasan knows Antakya, Rize, all over Turkey. There were these, movements of movements. So it wasn't a localized thing. I have a very strict understanding of revolution. I'm not against it, but it's not there yet. And that's why I said these are early signs of hegemonic crisis. I'm talking from a critical theory point of view, and Mehmet said, don't pass around for postmodernism. I'm not a postmodernist, I strongly object. Critical theory explains this best, because Gramsci's preoccupation is this: why are these hegemonic structures so resilient? What can we do about this? This is the point, it's not about, that's why the pessimism of the intellect. The forces out there are very strong. Universities, I mean, now this is happening in Turkey. I was preoccupied with the recruitment strategies as a program leader next year, whether I am refable or affable or whatever, the next ref, I was just running out of these meetings and watching what's happening in Turkey. I should be there, instead of this kind of managerialist crap. This is what I'm talking about. So this is all I can say. When we talk about revolution, I'm really excited, but we have to be really, really careful. This is what I want.
I'll just. My perspective, personal perspective, is of course has to do with my background in the sense that I am a member of the post-1980 military coup generation, and we did not. I'm at the upper limit of the acceptably young group of activists in Gezi Park, being 30 years old. We're a generation that did not live through the trials and tribulations of the 60s and the 70s, and we're very much brought up devoid of the ideological teachings and struggles of those generations, partly because either our parents suffered from it and they didn't want the same, they just basically said don't forget about it, or more systematically, the ideology was basically taken out of society, and we were kind of bred as consumerists. And this was the idea about the post-80 generation in Turkey. So for a person not having lived through this sort of an experience, or something that's comparable, like the May Day experience in Taksim Square, what I would like to say is that being in person in Gezi Park when it was under occupation was something that I knew it was going to be very different. I knew it was going to be new, but I just couldn't fathom how new it would be. And that's what perhaps would be my answer to what do we learn from these occupations. The first few days, the first 4 or 5 days of the protests, I was watching them from afar. I was far away, and it was the social media, the sharings, the videos and comments, and it did, of course, have an effect. I still felt a part of it, but being physically in Gezi Park, in Taksim Square, when it was under occupation with barricades, surrounded by it, with no police, a true post-apocalyptic utopia, where you have to basically, as you said, devise new ways of interaction, and which you do with incredible creativity and also communication. I guess the idea is that we can't really put our finger on what has happened and what we really want, but we're just, maybe our generation is just figuring out new ways of putting these thoughts into action and communicating these thoughts. And they just realized, hold on, there are new ways, there are new avenues of doing this. So in that sense, I'm inspired as someone of this generation. And that would be my 2 cents.
On my comments, just quick words on the comment on Brazil. I think it's more like a populist neoliberalism rather than a change in course. I think it's benefiting a lot of the upper lower class and actually marginalizing, the lower income groups. When I was in Kenya and I was doing some work with Muungano, which is a social movement in Kenya in urban areas, and I was asking one of the local leaders about how he's going to go about to actually mobilize his communities to come about with a community plan. And we were discussing that, and then I put to him, why don't you just have an election, have some committees and etc. He said, are you crazy? Bringing elections to this place is going to create a huge, it's going to generate problems, people are going to start fighting, there's ethnic conflict, we just come about with a very strong ethnic conflict here in this country. Elections, liberal democratic principles in this context is going to be chaotic. Suddenly my Brazilian liberal democracy ship starts saying, oh my God, what's going on here? We're not talking about that. Go back to Brazil and I look at the scenarios here. When you ask about the countryside, for many years, at least for the last 20 years, we have the landless movement has been strategically organizing civil society groups in the inner city areas into social movements in the urban areas, which has been called the homeless movements, the sem-teto movements. We are actually reproducing a lot of these alternative modes of production, in organizing spaces and modes of production, the way of organizing themselves, which is actually very interesting, and I think we can draw a lot of lessons from them. And one of them is not to focus on consensus. It's not to focus on actually liberal ideals of democracy that we all should hold hands and go aspire towards the same positivist goals. We need to focus on these disjunctions. We need to focus on what actually are the differences emerging from here, that from those disjunctions we can actually try to think about more structural change, because otherwise we're going to fall back into the traps of hegemonic power that Gramsci talks about and actually reproducing an ecosystem. So the positive side of things from my side is actually these emerging social movements that have a different notions of even what democracy should be about. And I think that's a very interesting side of things.
I'd just like to wrap up, take my liberty as moderator, just to say a couple of things. I think it's been quite interesting this evening to hear this kind of ideas of how this new democracy, new ideas of democracy, new futures in Turkey will come about. When I first saw the demonstrations, and I did think of this kind of the secular versus Erdogan supporters and this kind of thing, but I realized that it's much more complex and much more in a way much more positive and much more pluralistic than that, what's happening in Turkey. I've been going there for about 13 years, working in various different contexts, and I've seen this kind of from 2000s increasing sort of oppression in terms of the way that laws are being changed, the way that, for example, around mass housing and how mass housing is being distributed, and various kind of small changes that have been going on over the years. And this has been kind of from people I've been talking to, the changes from something that's quite positive to increasing resistance, increasing tension, increasing problems, and increasing difficulties, people feeling difficulties and feeling very angry towards what's happening there. So I've been watching this for several years, and I feel quite positive after this evening on what are the possibilities for the future. I think it's a bit difficult to make these comparisons between Brazil and Turkey, because you're talking about two very, very different politics, you're talking about two very, very different histories. And this is, I think, quite a complex analysis that would need understanding. For example, the role of local government. This is completely different. The role of social movements in Turkey versus Brazil. I mean, you have such a different history. But I think interesting to bring that into this debate. So I would like to say thank you to all of our panelists very much, and thank you to all of the guests for